All right, we'll say good morning. Let us begin. I'll just begin a few seconds early so I could start with the dedications and we can begin with the Daf and Meretz Hashem on time. I want to begin by thanking all of our Daf Yomi sponsors, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tevis, Dobi and Nina Elman, for dedicating all the Shurim and Joshos this month in the honor of the Bas Mitzvah of the Dora Ayelet. May she continue to grow into an incredible and true Bas Yisrael. I'm sorry. Okay, I want to thank our weekly sponsors, the Pachino Mishpacha Le'ilei Nishmas Moshe Ben Sion's mother on the occasion of our first yahrzeit, Leah Rachel Bas Shmuel, the Pollock family on the occasion of the yahrzeit of Paul's aunt Esther Bas Zechariah, may the Neshama have an aliyah on the family in Nechama, the Steinmetz family for dedicating the Shiurim this week in honor of the birthdays of their Bechor, Adam Steinmetz, and his Bechor, Judah Steinmetz, and an appreciation to all of the Shiurim. May Meretz Hashem, the entire Steinmetz Mishpacha, experience incredible and beautiful growth in the years to come. And our Daf Yomi shir this morning is sponsored by Benny Goldberg. Le'iloi Nishmas, the neshama of his precious father, Avraham Leib Ben Asher Pinchas, Mr. Leonard Goldberg. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, his neshama will have an aliyah and his family a nechama. We also dedicate our learning in the Zechus of Refuah Shalema for Ruchama Aviva Bas Sheina Chana, as well as the Zechus of Refuah Shalema for Rachel Yehudis Bas Tova Gittel. So we'll see with that. Let us begin. We have a lot to do today. Some incredible Gemara, as well as some incredibly fascinating Halacha Lemaisa. So we'll say, so we are picking up today's daf is Chav Zayin. But you wouldn't know that from where we are picking up in today's daf. We are picking up on Chav Vav Amud Beis, the middle of the daf. Tanu Rabbanan, so in Mamish, the middle of 26b. It's a lot to do today, but it's going to go quickly. Says the Gemara, Tanu Rabbanan, Tashma, Mochri Ksos. Actually, Yerachmiel Bach asked me this question 2 days ago. I promised him we were going to get to it in yesterday's daf, but I lost a little bit of time because of my technical issues. So we have it today. So Tashma, but remember again, still in the sugya, the machlokes Abayi and Rava about getting hana'ah, what we call in a non-normative fashion. What is the status of getting hana'ah trying to find the right angle, getting hana in a non-normative fashion, or quote unquote, in a case of against one's will, or when one doesn't have a choice. So the Gemara says as follows: Tashma, mochri ksus, both the people who sell clothing salespeople, mochrin ksus, mochrin kidakron, b'vachli is kavim mecham neacham gsham neacham. So we'll say this is about people who sell clothing, and happens that they're selling clothing which is muktzah. So what's the halacha of somebody selling clothing which is muktzah? So the halacha is they could sell in a normal way. I was supposed to say the way they used to sell clothing is the salesperson would don the clothing. But the problem is, let's say the article of clothing that you're selling is halacha l'maisa muktzah. Rashi says over here, mochrin kidarkan mu'utafin b'ksus kilayim. So we'll say, I'm selling shatnez. Now, the truth is, at the end of the day, I can't wear shatnez, but isn't love dafur that isn't. So we'll see. So I'm selling my clothing that's shatnez, my wares that are shatnez. How would you normally sell your article of clothing? You would go ahead, you would put it on, and you would model it, and people would look at it. They would say, oh, nice jacket. I want that. So what's the halacha? You're permitted to do that. But you're allowed to do this as long as you intend not to have hana'ah. That if it's warm outside, you shouldn't have in mind that it's protecting you against the sun. And if it's raining outside, that is protecting you against the rain. Vatznuin, the modest ones, mafshilin la'acharei b'makom. So we'll say the modest, what the Gemara calls the modest people, would not wear the article of clothing, even though, again, technically speaking, they could wear the shatnez clothing. In order to go ahead and sell it, the modest individuals would not do so. Instead, they would go ahead, put the article of clothing on a stick, hold the stick behind them, and halacha l'maisa, that's how they would sell the clothing. So both say, so you see from here that halacha l'maisa, there is another alternative. This is, remember, going back to yesterday's daf, this is a case of efshar. This is a case of where you can conduct yourself in a way where you don't have to benefit from the Isser Hana. So it's Efshar, right? It's a case of Efshar. And ultimately, again, even if you don't have Kavana, so both it is, I don't have to wear the shatnez clothing. That's number one. And ultimately, again, we see as long as I don't have Kavana to get benefits from the shatnez, it's permitted to yufta leman demasnin l'shnakama derava to yufta. This refutes the first version of the opinion of Rava, and indeed this is a refutation. So we'll say, how do we paskin halacha l'maisa? Because in reality, this is a really fascinating case. We'll say, you can still hear me okay on Zoom? Okay, excellent. So we'll say, so this is really an incredibly fascinating case. So we'll say, what do you do in a case of benefit, quote unquote, against your will? What is the halacha efshar versus lo efshar? So the Rambam in Hilchos Ma'achalos Asuros Parak Yudal Halacha Yud Beis writes as follows. Listen to these words. He says, Mashi, thank you for adjusting. It's nice to see the Chevra and the Shul as well. So the Rambam writes as follows. He says, Haniya habado li adam bal karcho. If a person gets benefit, hana from something that is usher, and he gets that hana, quote unquote, against his will, ultimately, again, so we'll say, so remember, we're talking about now a person, quote unquote, gets benefit against his will. Now, remember, I will say, is we're defining against his will. It's not that like someone is shoving a piece of chazer down my throat. The idea is that hana of something that is usher is coming my way, but ultimately, again, it's unavoidable. We'll call it like that. It's unavoidable. So the Gemara says, what's the halacha? In this kavin usher, v'imlonis kavin mutter. If you have kavana to get benefits from it, it is usher. If you don't have kavana to get benefit from it, it is mutter. So Rabbi will say, to illustrate this with the case that the Rosh and the Ran use, for example, again, I'm walking by, I have to get home. There's only one path to get home. My path to get home runs past a house of Avodah Zarah. So what happens now? So now they happen to be burning incense in the house of Avodah Zarah. This is the only path home. So it's lo afshar. I have no other way of getting home. The incense is there. It smells beautiful. But I don't have kavana. My kavana is not to benefit from the incense. The kavana is the benefit is happening, but it's not my kavana. So therefore, again, the Rambam paskins that halacha l'maisa that would be mutter. So in a case of lo afshar, where it's unavoidable, as long as I don't have kavana, even if I end up benefiting from something that is usher, it is mutter. Good. Both that closes that sugya. Both now we begin another fascinating sugya. Tanur Rabbanan. Listen to this. If you fire up an oven with shells of orla, or with kashin, or again with the husks of klai hakerem. So we'll say both of these items ultimately again are aser ba'ana. Arla, fruit of the first 3 years. Klai hakerem, forbidden mixtures which grow in a vineyard. What's the halacha? Chadash yutas. So we'll say if you fired up a brand new oven with these items, the oven must be destroyed. Yutas literally means it must be smashed. The idea being that the final step in constructing an oven is firing it up. That ultimately, again, is the final step in the construction of the actual oven itself. So therefore, if the oven was actually completed with Isuri Hana, then the oven itself becomes Asr Bana. However, Yashan, if the oven was already completed beforehand, but you just happen to fire it up now with these items that are Asr Bana, Yutsan, all you need to do is let it cool down, and after it cools down, it once again becomes permitted Bahana. In other words, when I say permitted Bahana, you can use the oven again. What happens if you baked bread inside of the oven? Rabbi Omer Hapasasur, Rabbi says that the bread ultimately again is Asr. Now, we're assuming right now when we talk about baking bread, that you're baking bread in the same fire. In other words, that I fired up an oven with arla or with klai hakerem. And now the first part of the brisa spoke about the status of the oven. Second part of the brisa spoke about the status, now is speaking about the status of bread that's baked in it. So Rebbe says the bread is aser. Chacham say the bread is mutter. So the Gemara says, we'll see the svara on this. I mean, Rashi says, according to Rebbe, the reason why the bread is aser, the phrase is the yesh shevach eitzim bapas, because literally again the presence of the wood is felt, or the presence of the heat source is felt in the bread. So this bread is considered as if it has klai hakerem, or as if it has arla inside of it. The chum say no, it's mutter. We'll see what. Bishla gabe gechalim. But if you bake the bread on top of coals, divrei hakol mutter. Everyone agrees that the bread is mutter. So therefore, I will say 3 halachas. Halacha number 1 is if you fired up an oven for the first time. If you fired up an oven for the first time, in with klai hakerem or with arla, so halacha lamaisa again, the oven will be usher. If the oven was already solidified beforehand, you just have to let it cool down before using it again. If you baked bread inside of that oven that is being fired up with klai hakerem or arla, Rebbe says the bread will be usher, and the chachamim say the bread is mutter. What happens if you cooked on top of coals of arla, coals of klai hakerem? Everyone will agree that halacha lamaisa it is mutter. So what's now watch this. I've Tanya, but we learned bein chadash, bein yashan, yutzan. There's another brisa that says whether the oven was new or whether the oven was old, you don't have to smash anything, even if you fired it up with klai hakerem or with arla. Rather, yutzan, all you have to do is let it cool down. To which the Gemara says, so also that contradicts what we just said before. Beforehand, we said that halacha lamaisa again. You need to go ahead. If it's new, you need to smash it. But if it's old, you just need to let it cool down. Lo kasha harebi harabanan. To which the Gemara says, it's not a contradiction. One is Rebbe, one is the Rabbanan. Rebbe is the one who requires you ultimately to smash it, right? And the Rabbanan are the ones who require you just to go ahead and let it cool down. To which the Gemara says, Rashi says, Ha Rebbe diktani chadash yutatz Rebbe. So we assume the same Rebbe who said that halacha lamaisa, the loaf of bread is going to be usher, is going to be the same Rebbe who's going to say that with a new oven, when the oven was solidified through klai hakerem or through arla, that you have to smash it. So 1 second. Amar Desham say the Rebbe Mishum the Yeshevach Itzi Bepas. Zev Zegore Misham. Say so. This is actually very interesting. All I know, Rebbe says that the bread is usher. Why? Because remember, if you bake bread in an oven that is being fueled with klai hakerem or with arla, Rebbe's positions, and remember this phrase, yesh shevach eitzim bepas, which means that the identity of the heat source is embedded in the item that is being baked. So therefore, again, there's arla, there's klai hakerem in that bread. We'll say that's different than this case. In this case over here, when the Gemara says that halacha lemaisa you have to smash an oven. So we'll say what that makes it sound like is as follows. According to the first part of the brisa, we're saying if you have a new oven that you fired up right for the first time with klai hakerem or with arla, so the first price is said that halacha lemaisa you have to smash it. Then I will say what that makes it sound like is even if you were, let's say now you let that oven cool down, and now you heated it up again with a permitted heat source, and you baked bread in that again. The first price, it seems to indicate that halacha lemaisa, the oven, that bread baked the second time would also be usher. But who says that's the opinion of Rebbe? See, Rebbe say that would be a case of zev zegorim. Let me explain this in just a moment. If you have an oven that was heated up the first time with arla or with klai hakerem, that means the identity of that oven has been concretized and solidified with a davar ha'aser, which I understand for that oven has an embedded identity of Isser in it. Okay, now the oven cools down. Now I use the oven a second time. This time I go ahead and I heat it up with a permitted heat source. So now the shaila is, what's the status of the loaf of bread that's being baked in there? So the Gemara says, Rebbe says that would be Aser. The Gemara says, 1 second. Who says Rebbe says that will be Aser? Because we'll say that case I just described is what's called in halacha, zeh v'zeh goring. Two things causing an outcome. But one thing is mutter, one thing is aser. We'll say, so listen to this. So you have an oven that was solidified with we're called arla or klai hakerem. So there's an oven, quote unquote, that has an identity of iser. But now remember, in the second round, the wood is permitted. So an aser oven, permitted wood, produce a loaf of bread. That's called zev zegorim. So the Gemara says, all I know is that Rebbe holds when you bake a loaf of bread in an oven and the heat source is arla or klai hakerem, Rebbe says that's aser. You can't extrapolate from that necessarily that Rebbe would say in a case of zev zegorein that it would also be aser. To which the Gemara says, Rebbe only says that if you bake a loaf of bread inside of an oven that is being fired up with arlo, with klai hakerem, that is aser. Zev is egorim mishamas. Like who says that Rabbi would say that it's aser in the case of zev is egorim? And lokash harabi lazer harabanan. Both like the two brackets reflect the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanan. Okay. Hey Rabbi Eliezer, which Rabbi Eliezer are you talking about? Ilima, you see Ilima Rabbi Eliezer, this Sa'ar, if you want to say it's Rabbi Eliezer of Sa'ar, of yeast, what's that case? This nan Sa'ar shel chulin mishal truma shenaf luzoki. So what's the interesting case? Let's say you have yeast of chulin and of truma that fell into a dough. Well, see now, obviously, it's not the case. I'm not a Kohen, so therefore, again, there's the right. I have both yeast of truma and chulin that fell into my dough. And neither of them have the ability to cause the dough to become chametz on their own. What's the halacha? Vinit starfu. And now what happens? Halacha l'maisa. They go ahead and combine, right? The Gemara says, and together they cause the dough to become chametz. So we'll say, so what is this? This is a great case. This is a case of zev goreng. You have the yeast of chulin, the yeast of truma, jointly causing the dough to become chametz. So what is the status of the dough? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Eliezer Omer acharon aniba. Rabbi Eliezer says, we go by whichever was the second yeast to fall in. Whichever was the second one to fall in, halacha l'maisa, that is the one that determines the identity of the dough. The Chacham say, no, the olam eino oser tap of chavzayin ad sheyehei bo kedei lahachmes. The Chacham say, we don't care which one came in first, which one came in second. At the end of the day, here's what we look at. Does the davar ha'aser, does the prohibited item have enough power on its own to cause the dough to become chametz? And if the answer to that is no, then the dough is going to be permitted. If the answer to that is no, then the dough is going to be permitted. And therefore, again, Abaye says, Lo shon elo shekidei misilek esa iser. And Abaye says that ultimately, again, so Abaye will say that according to the opinion who says, Rabbi Eliezer, who says the acharon aniba, that we look at the last item that fell in, that's only if the isser was removed. But if halacha l'maisa you did not remove in this case the isser, which is the yeast of truma, then ultimately again aser, it's aser. We'll say why? Because then according to Rabbi Eliezer, you would have both yeast of truma, yeast of chulin, and what is that? Alma zev gorem aser. So from here, you will say that what zev gorem is aser. That when you have two things, one heter, one isser, both causing a result, ultimately, again, the result is going to be aser. And therefore, we'll say, let's take this back. Therefore, in the case where you have an oven that was originally fired up with wood of arla klaya kerem, now the oven cools down. Now you bake a loaf of bread in there with permitted wood. So we'll say that's the case of zet gorim, the oven, which has an identity of Isra because it was solidified with a davra aser, wood that is now permitted, jointly coming together to go ahead and bake off a loaf of bread. It would appear that according to Rabbi Eliezer, he would say that that's aser because zev gorim is aser. Where does Rabbi Eliezer say zev gorim is aser? That's what we just saw. According to Rabbi Eliezer, if you have the truma yeast and the chulin yeast and they both fall into the dough and they're both there, Rabbi Eliezer says the dough is going to be aser because zeh goreng. Versus the Chachamim who will say no, the only time halacha l'maisa it is going to be aser is in a situation where the davar ha'isser has enough power on its own to make the dough chametz. Good. Or we might time Rabbi Eliezer kabaye. How do you know that Rabbi Eliezer's logic is like abaye? Dilma time Rabbi Eliezer shum da acharon aniba lo shna kidei misilik esa iser lo shna lo kidei misilik esa iser. So we'll say, who says that Abaye interpreted Rabbi Eliezer's position, but who says that Rabbi Eliezer actually holds like Abaye? Maybe at the end of the day, Rabbi Eliezer does not make a distinction whether you took out the davar ha'aser or not, and therefore again, ultimately again, aval bebas achos hachanami deshari. So we'll say ultimately again, according to Rabbi Eliezer, really all we look at is what is the last item that came in. If the mutter yeast came in last, then the dough is mutter. If the aser yeast came in last, then the dough is aser. Acharon aniba. That's all. Maybe this is not a zev gorim issue. Ella Rabbi Eliezer the Atzi Asheri. You're right. So we'll say when we are trying to identify the position of Rabbi Eliezer who holds Zev Zegorim, it is a different Rabbi Eliezer. Which Rabbi Eliezer is it? Rabbi Eliezer of Asherah. Watch this. This now incredible case. Nakol Himena eats in. We'll say if you took branches off an Asherah tree, Asur and Bahana, ultimately again the branches are Asur Bahana. We'll say so again. You might have thought that an Asherah tree is only Asur, only has the identity of Avodah Zarah when it's intact. When it's intact. But if Halacha Lamais again, it wasn't intact, then again, it's not Asur. No, even if you remove the branches are Asur Bana. Watch this. Hisik Satan, or if you use the branches to fire up an oven, so what's the status of the oven? Sigmar says it depends. Chadash, if it's a brand new oven. I've also, I think I clarified this one. Let me explain. When we say new oven, remember again, the way you make an oven, this is good to know. You're making an oven out of earthenware, you fashion it, you let it dry in the sun. The final step in completing your oven is firing it up. That was the final step. That solidified the kli. So when we say chadash, we're talking about an oven that is being fired up for the first time, which again is the complete. It's the makeh b'patish. That's the completion of the kli. So the Gemara says chadash. If it's a brand new oven, yutatz, since it was fired up and therefore completed with Ansei Asher, has to be destroyed. Yashan, but if it's an old oven, meaning it was already completed, it was already fired up the first time and completed with a permitted heat source, then what? Then halacha lamaisa, you just let it cool down, and once it cools down, it's permitted for use. Afa boas hapas. What happens if you baked bread inside of it? So asura. Ultimately, again, if you baked bread inside of this oven, now the assumption we're talking about over here is you're baking bread while the oven is being heated by the Aseh Asherah. So in that case, hapas asura. Ultimately, again, it's aser. It's aser ba'ano, right? Because again, it's being fueled with Aseh Asherah. This arba ba'acheros ba'acheros ba'acheros. We'll say now we come into another. So we'll say so. Therefore, again, so what we're saying over here is that halacha l'maisa. Let's say you went ahead and you baked bread in an oven that's being heated with Atzei Asherah. So the Gemara says that halacha l'maisa, the bread is going to be aser. Now, I want to point something out that's very important over here. The Gemara seems to understand that halacha l'maisa, that bread is going to be aser, whether you're baking it in a new oven or an old oven. So you see where this is going. That already appears to be a case of zev zegorim. Hold on. So the Gemara says, however, what happens if now you take that loaf of bread and that loaf of bread gets mixed up with other loaves of bread? Ba'acheros. What's that? Ultimately, again, all the loaves are asur ba'ana. And I will say, b'pashtos, the reason for that is because avodah zarah is never bottled. Right? Avodah zarah is never bottled. There's no bittul b'shishim, bittul b'meya, bittul b'elef. Avodah zarah is not bottled. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Rabbi Eliezer says, no, all you need to do is take the value of the loaf, value of the wood, and throw it into Yamamel, throw it into the Dead Sea. Which most say is another way of saying, essentially, take the value of that benefit and throw it away so that you get no value from the Avodah Zarah. They said, that doesn't work by Avodah Zarah. There's no redemption by Avodah Zarah. So we just said before, there's no bittul, there's no redemption by Avodah Zarah. Once something is tainted by Avodah Zarah, that tainting does not leave. To which the Gemara says, so again, you see from here that Rabbi Eliezer holds that Allah again, zev zegorim. And furthermore, the Gemara says, Emer desham said Rabbi Eliezer about Avodah Zarah d'chamir. But we'll say, but maybe Rabbi Eliezer only holds this, ultimately, again, of zev zegorim by Avodah Zarah, because of the chumrah of Avodah Zarah. However, again, the Gemara says, B'shari Isurin Shabbatorah Misham Islay, but how do you know that he holds it by other Isurin? I was supposed to say, all I know is that Halacha L'maisa Rabbi Eliezer holds Zev Zegorim is Asher by Avodah Zarah. How do I know that he applies that ultimately against other Isurim? Ela Imkain Aman Tarmiyeh. So we'll say, so remember, so if he doesn't hold this way, then Halacha L'maisa, to whom do we attribute the original Brisa that we had on Chavav Amud Beis? Right, so we'll say somebody is telling me that halacha l'maisa, again, an oven after it's been fired up for the first time with orla with klai kerem, even right, that ultimately again such an oven is forever tainted. So whose opinion is that? So the Gemara says, and I will say furthermore again, we see that the Brisa says Rabbi Eliezer would answer the same way, Kol Yisrael Shabbat Torah. So that position which he espoused by Avodah Zarah, by bread made with atzi ashera, that it is going to be usher, even if it's made in a totally mutter oven, because it's zev zegorim. Two things are causing its creation. Rabbi Eliezer holds zev zegorim is usher by other isurim sheva Torah as well. So Amar Abaye says, so okay. So now what we kind of have over here is as follows. It appears that Rabbi Eliezer is this mystery shita of the who holds zev zegorim is usher, and therefore we'll say, coming back to the oven case, if you were to have an oven that was initially fired up with klaya kerem or with arla, so that oven retains an isser identity. Even if now you were to bake bread, right? Let's say then it cools down, you were to bake bread in it, and you now use permitted wood. Halacha l'maisa, it would appear that it's Rabbi Eliezer, that wood would still, that bread would still be usser because it's zeh v'zeh goring, a prohibited oven, permitted wood, creating bread, and halacha l'maisa Rabbi Eliezer holds that zeh v'zeh goring is usser. Amar Abaye says, "Imtim Slomar Zev Zegorim Aser Rabbi Hainu Rabbi Eliezer." So we'll see if you hold Zev Zegorim is Aser, then Rabbi holds the same position as Rabbi Eliezer. Okay. Then Imtim Slomar Zev Zegorim Mutter v'Hacha Mishum Diyesh Shevach Itzim Bepas. So we'll say, and if you say that halacha l'mais in general, Zev Zegorim is going to be mutter. Zev Zegorim is mutter. If you would hold that in general, then what? Then halacha l'maisa. The reason why this case is problematic. Then what? The Gemara says, see, Rebbe say, the reason why Rebbe holds, let's go back for a moment to the position of Rebbe. Rebbe says that halacha l'maisa, if you fired up an oven with wood of orla klaya kerem, and you bake bread in that oven. So leaving aside the identity of the oven for just a moment, you bake bread in that oven, what's the halacha? Rebbe said the loaf is aser. Why is the loaf aser? Rebbe's position, mishum diyesh shevach eitzim bepas. Because the identity of the bread, the identity of the wood is embedded in the bread. The identity of the wood is embedded in the bread. So the Gemara says, if you hold Yesheva Eitzim Bepas, Hani Karos Vikosos Utsluchios Asiri. They both say ultimately again, literally again, these plates, these cups, or these platters, these plates and these cups should all be usher. Now we'll say, now what is this talking about? Take a look at Rashi. It's Rashi in the third wide line. Rashi towards the bottom. Rashi says, so we'll say, so therefore again, if you have, let's say, earthenware utensils that you have fired up in an oven, right? That you fired up in an oven, and that oven was fueled with wood of Asherah, ultimately again, they should be usher. So we'll say, therefore again, if you had earthenware vessels which were solidified through fire, and that fire came from branches of an asherah, then halacha l'maaseh, the utensils should be aser, because we'll say again, same idea as the loaf of bread, according to Rebbe, yesh shevach eitzim instead of bepas bekalim, to which the Gemara says, kepligi. So we'll say, where does the machlokes come up? In the case of an oven or of a pot. How so? According to the opinion who says zev gorem, ultimately is usher. These will be usher as well. We'll say, look at Rashi for just a moment. See, we'll say, here's the interesting part. In a pot or in an oven, again, where there is no benefit. There is no benefit. So remember, let's say you have an oven or you have a pot which were solidified with wood that is aser. Okay, so now the utensil is finished. So then I will say those utensils are not usable until you introduce a new heat source. And let's assume for a moment now that the second heat source that you introduce is permitted. So I will say, so watch this. So now the status is I have an oven that was finished, that was solidified with Atzei Asherah, or let's use Arla and Klaya Kerem, or a pot that was forged with Klaya Kerem or Arla. Fine, now it cooled down. Now I want to cook something in it with permitted wood. So the shaila, of course, is the stuff that I cook inside of it mutter or not? Lamandam Zev Zegorim mutter shari. So it's according to the opinion who says Zev Zegorim is mutter, there's no problem using this pot or this oven. So the Gemara says, I'm sorry, skip line. Lamandar Zev Zegorim aser. Lamandar Zev Zegorim mutter shari. Supposed to say, this is an interesting shaila. So now I have a pot or I have an oven that were solidified with iser, but now the utensil cooled down. Can I go ahead and use that oven with permitted wood? Can I use that pot with permitted wood? Well, it depends. If you hold zev zegorim is mutter, then it's mutter. If you hold zev zegorim is aser, then it's aser. Ikadami, an alternate version of this. Mutter kedera asura. Even according to the opinion who says that zev zegorim is mutter, the pot will still be asur. Why? The kibla bishula mikamei denitan eats in the atera. Because also there is benefit from the pot even before the new wood is introduced. What's the benefit of the pot before the new wood is introduced? Because also the pot is a receptacle. The pot holds the food. So there's a benefit in its use as a receptacle even before the fire is introduced. So we'll say, how do we paskin here? So this is actually really quite interesting. So the Shulchan Aruch, the Rambam Paskins, this is in Hilchos Macholos Asuros, Parak Tes Zayin, Halachos, it's really Chav Aleph through Chav Gimel, so Chav Beisho, I'm not going to go through all of it, but just suffice it to say, the Rambam writes as follows, Taner Shesiko Beklipi Arlo Ubikloya Kerem, Ben Chodesh Ben Yatzon, Yutzon Ba'achakach Yachim, also Ba'asei Heter. So I'll say, listen to this. Salach Lamaisa, the Rambam Paskins, that halacha lamaisa, whether you kindled a new oven or an old oven with prohibited wood, you can't use the oven when the prohibited wood is burning inside of it. But once the oven cools down, whether it's a new oven or an old oven, the oven is permitted for use. So I'll say halacha lamaisa again. You see the Rambam essentially paskins that halacha lamaisa ze gorim ultimately again will be mutter. Yet interestingly enough, he says karos v'kosos kuderos utzluchos shebishlan yotze v'klipi arlo hara'elu asurin b'haniya sh'davar ha'asr b'haniya asa osan chadash. So we'll say, so again, yet if you have an item that is exclusively formed ultimately again through a davar ha'isr, ultimately the Rambam says it maintains that asr status. Okay, so there's much more to do in the sugya, but lamaisa at least we're introduced to the concept of zev zegorim, and we recognize that halacha lamaisa is a machlokes. Good. I'm Rabbi Yosef Yehuda. I'm Shmuel. Taner shesigav klipa arla abekashin haklaya kerem. So let's say, let's go back. So now we said before, you have an oven that was fired up with arla or with klaya kerem. Chadash yutatz, if it's a brand new oven, you destroy it. Yashan yutzan, if it's old, you let it cool down. What happens if you went ahead and you baked bread inside of it? Rebbe says the bread is mutter. And ultimately again, and the Chachamim say that the bread is aser. Really? We learn just the opposite. We learn Rebbe holds that the bread is aser, and the Chachamim say that the bread is mutter. So the Gemara says, Shmuel ipchatani. Okay, Shmuel just stated, he accidentally stated it in the reverse order. Fine, so a mistake. If you guys see me, possibly we'll say first wide line. So let's listen to this. This is incredible. Shmuel said in general, that there's a concept that the halacha follows Rebbe mechavero. When Rebbe's arguing against someone else, generally again halacha follows Rebbe. When it's one against one, the halacha follows Rebbe. However, v'lo mechaverav. When Rebbe is arguing against the group, like the Rabban and the Chachamim, the halacha does not follow Rebbe. Therefore, technically speaking, in this case of the loaf of bread, the halacha should follow the Chachamim, but it doesn't. In this case, interestingly enough, the halacha happens to follow Rebbe. The savar asne ipcha ki hechi dinekom rabbanon l'isura. So I will say, so Shmuel was nervous that what if he gives over the halacha stated, namely that Rebbe says the loaf is aser, Chacham say that loaf is mutter, people automatically assume the halacha follows like the Chachamim, because the halacha is not like Rebbe mechave Rav. Whenever Rebbe argues against the collective, the halacha follows the collective, except in this case. Therefore, Shmuel switched the names intentionally, so that the halacha l'maisa should be quoted in the name of the Rabbanan, so that people should just not get confused. So also, it's actually a fascinating idea about the ability sometimes to attribute different a statement, the halacha, a concept, to someone whom you know people will accept it from, even if that person is not the one who actually said it. Now one has to be very careful with the application of that concept, because there's another Mamar Chazal of Kala Omer Davar B'Shem Omro, maybe Geula Liolam, about the need for proper attribution. But you see that in halacha, you see what Shmuel's doing over Shmuel knows the halacha is that the loaf is aser. But the problem is if I attribute it to Rebbe and people see Rebbe arguing on the Rabban, it's going to cause a whole bunch of confusion. So Shmuel purposely switches the names and attributes the aser opinion ultimately to the majority, to the Rabbanim. Incredible. So also remember again, the Brisa said before that if you cooked the loaf of bread on top of coals, so this is Atse Arla Klaya Kerem, that's no longer wood, but now coals, ultimately the bread is mutter. Chad Amar Lo shana ela gechalim omamos. Aval gechalim lo chashos aser. That's only true if the coals we're both say are omamos. Now Rashi says almost pretty much are like extinguished coals, non-flaming coals. They're hot, but there's no present flame. And one opinion says, and the other opinion said, no, even if the coals themselves are burning, right? Burning. Nami mutar. I understand why burning coals or coals that lit coals are going to be asur, because Rabbi say again, because then again, if the coals are lit, then halacha l'maisa, the wood is still in existence, and yesheva eitzim bas, as you said before, elamandam rafi lochushos mitaras pas the asur, the yesheva eitzim bepas the Rebbe heichem mishkachas. Rabbi say, according to the opinion who says that even lochashos, right, even coals that are on fire are going to be mutter, then how do you understand that according to Rebbe who holds that shevach eitzim bepas is asur? To which the Gemara says, heichem mishkachas, amra papa, kisha kinegdo. I will say, what's the case? The case could probably look at Rashi, kinegdo, kineged apas mavira itzim befiatanor. So I will say, where you have the actual torch that's lighting the wood. In other words, when the wood itself is on fire, that's when Rebbe would hold that halacha l'maisa yeshavach itzim bepas, that the identity of the wood is embedded in the bread when the actual wood is on fire. But once the wood is gone and the coal, and it's just coals, the Gemara suggests could even be that even if the coals are mamish on fire themselves, once it's coal, it's no longer wood. And once it's no longer wood, ein shevach eitzim bepas. Good, on the base. So I'll say what it makes it sound like is according to the Rabbanon, even when the wood itself is lit, right? Even with literally means the torch is there, lighting the wood. Halacha l'maisa, again, the Rabbanon will say that it's mutter because the Rabbanon don't subscribe to the idea of the Eish Shevach Eitzim Bepas. Ella Eitzim the Isur the Rabbanon Heichem Mishkachas. So what's according to the Rabbanon, where do you ever find the case of Eitzim the Isura of Rabbi Ayi Bar Chama Bishar Shifa? So we'll say, I'll tell you where's the case. We'll say according to the Rabbanon hold in Shevach Eitzim Bepas, and therefore again, when you use wood as a heat source, that might be usher. You might be getting hana, but the identity of the heat source does not transfer into the bread itself. However, so where is there considered to be illegal use of prohibited wood? For example, you build a bench. So you build the bench out of Atse Arla, or you build the bench out of Klai Hakerem. That would be a case of illegal use of prohibited wood. Good. So let's listen to this. Let's switch gears for a moment. What happens now? You fired up your oven now with, we'll say, wood of hekdish, wood which belongs to the Beis Hamikdash, and you went ahead and you baked bread. So we'll say we've dealt so far with avodah zarah as a heat source, arla, klaya kerem. Now we're using wood that belonged to the Beis Hamikdash as the heat source for your oven, and you baked bread. So what's the status? We'll say the bread. The Rabbanon, the Shar B'Kamai Samai, according to the Rabbanon who said that the original bread, right, which was the bread that was baked with wood of Arla and Klaya Kerem, what's the halacha here? Amelia Pasasura. Even the Rabbanon would agree that in this case the bread is asur. Why? Uma Bein Zeli Arla. Why should this case of wood of hektish be any different than the wood of Arla? To which the Gemara says, Amarabba, Hachi Hashta Arla B'Tela B'Masayim. Hektish Atilu Be'elef Lo Bottle. Wow. Very big difference. We'll say Arla, Klaya Kerem are bottle. They're bottle. Hekdish is never bottle. So we'll say, what does that tell you? What that tells you is that the identity of Hekdish is a much stronger identity than of Arla or Klaya Kerem. Therefore, even the Rabbanon who will say, in the case of Klaya Kerem or Arla, that Ein Shevach Itzim Bepas, that the identity of the heat source is not embedded in the bread, will agree that by Hekdish, they will agree with Rebbe, that the identity of the heat source is embedded in the bread. Since hektish is never bottled, therefore the identity of the hektish makes its way into the item that it is baking. One second, there's a bigger kasha, I will say. If you're using wood of hektish to heat your stove, I will say, listen to this. The moment you take that wood and you put it into your oven, what have you done? You've committed an act of me'ilah, an act of trespass. So I'll say, what's me'ilah? Me'ilah is illegal, mundane usage of consecrated property. So halacha l'maisa, again, you've committed me'ilah. Now, why does that matter? We'll listen to this. Now, we'll say this is actually incredible. You know, once you commit an act of me'ilah, the item is actually no longer hekdesh. Now, we'll say that sounds a little bit strange, but it's modeled after the halachos of theft. You know, we'll say one of the interesting concepts by theft is when you steal something on a certain level, that item becomes yours. It becomes the property of the thief himself. So too, again, when you commit me'ilah, it's interesting. The item becomes yours, right? Literally, again, it becomes decommissioned, and ultimately, again, it becomes yours. So the Gemara says, so therefore, we'll say that's the case. That when you commit me'ilah, the item leaves hekdesh and it becomes yours. So therefore, it turns out what? Something amazing. When you're baking the bread, we'll say what's actually happened over here. You've actually baked the bread with chulin wood, it turns out, which is quite counterintuitive, but quite fascinating. So we'll say, what are we talking about over here? We're actually talking about wood. We're talking about wood that you decided to sell, and you are going to go ahead and use the proceeds to go ahead and purchase shlomim. But also remember, again, shlomim is a type of carbon consumed. Part of it goes to the mizbeach, part of it to kohanim, a large part of it to the owners. Ultimately, again, Shlomim, Rashi points out, are kachim kalim, lower level of sanctity, and interestingly enough, are not subject to me'ilah. So people say, in the case in question over when we say atzei hekdesh, this is wood that I plan to sell. I'm going to use the proceeds to go ahead and purchase shlomim. That's my intention. And now, instead of selling it to purchase shlomim, what do? I go and I use it to fire up my oven. This reflects the view of Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda holds that if you accidentally use hekdesh, it becomes deconsecrated. But if you intentionally misuse hekdesh, it does not become deconsecrated. But in my time alone, we'll say, why not? So the Gemara says, because we'll say, since it's not subject to me'ilah, because this is kachim kalin, then ultimately, again, it does not go out, does not become chulin. Shlomim nami kevan delav bar me'ilah ninu lo nafik lechulin. So I will say, so too over here in this case, halacha l'maisa, so you have wood that you are going to sell. Use the proceeds to purchase shlomim. Instead, you go out and you throw it into your oven. The bread is going to be aser. Why is the bread going to be aser? Because halacha l'maisa, that bread now shava. Because even the Rabbanan will agree that in the case of hekdesh, yesh shevach itzim bepas, and therefore halacha l'maisa, the loaf will be aser. What about the fact that when you use something illegally, me'ilah, ultimately that deconsecrates it? That doesn't work. That only works for something that is subject to me'ilah. But because this wood was going to be used to purchase shlomim is not subject to me'ilah, and therefore halacha l'maisa, but because you did it intentionally, it's not deconsecrated. Wow. Is that true? Every time you commit me'ilah, so the item becomes deconsecrated and becomes chulin. V'atani, we learned, kol hanisrafin afron mutter, will say anything you burn, right? Anything you burn, ultimately, again, it's afer. Its ash is mutter, chutz mi'atzi asher, with the exception of the asherah tree. The identity of all the zara remains even on the ashes. Ve'efer hekdish. And ultimately, again, the dust or the ashes of hekdish. So the Gemara says, the olam, so the Gemara, ve'efer hekdish, the olam aser. That seems to indicate again, so now you're burning hekdish, and it's still going to be aser, which seems to be that even after you do something with hekdish, it remains aser. To which the Gemara says, what's the case? The case I will say is where fire fell upon wood of hekdesh by itself. No one did it. The leka inish dinimo. So I'll say in a case where there was no me'ilah done to it, then ultimately the item still retains its identity. But when there was an act of me'ilah committed to the hekdesh, then the hekdesh, in fact, does become deconsecrated. Pretty amazing. Rabbi Shmaya Amar ba'osan shetu'unin geniza. Rabbi Shmaya is talking about those items, ultimately, again, which the Torah mandates that they be hidden away, that they require geniza. The sanya v'samo benachos, v'samo kulo, v'samo shloifaze. So we'll say there are certain things that halacha l'maisa, the Torah says, even after they've lost their original identity, halacha l'maisa, they still have to be hidden away. So we'll say, interestingly enough, the Gemara says over here, which is the halacha, that once you go ahead and you commit me'ilah with something, the item itself becomes chulin. So interestingly enough, it must be that the case that we're dealing with over here, where the bread cooked in an oven that was fired up with hektish wood, ultimately again is going to be usher, is a case of wood that was going to be sold for shlamim. Shlamim is kachin kalin not subject to me'ilah, and therefore the wood itself never deconsecrated. Therefore, even the chachamim agree that the bread ultimately again will be usher. Incredible. Also, let's just do one more line. Rabbi Yehuda Omer ein bir chametz ala sreifa. Rabbi Yehuda also halacha lemaisa. You can only accomplish bir chametz with sreifa. Tanya Amar Rabbi Yehuda ein bir chametz ala sreifa. Rabbi, this is the only way to burn chametz is with burning. Excuse me, the only way to destroy chametz is with burning. That didn't know saying Uman no sir shein lebal yira bal yimatzet on sreifa. We'll say no sir, left over from the carbon. So no sir, which is not subject to bal yira bal yimatzet, yet ultimately again requires sreifa. We'll say any leftover carbonic matter must be burnt. Chametz sheshlo bal yira bal yimatzet. The koshkin should tell sreifa. The chametz which is subject to the halachos of bal yira bal yimatzet should certainly be subject to sreifa. So amrulo. Kol din sha'ata dan tchilas lahakmer v'sofa lahakil eno din. They said to Rabbi Yehuda, any kavachomer that you tried to make in order to be machmir, but in the end turns out to be makel is not a proper kavachomer. Why? Lo matzah isim l'sofa yeyoshevu bata. Because what's according to Rabbi Yehuda, where you hold that chametz could only be destroyed with fire. So we'll say, what happens if it's Erev Pesach and you don't have fire, you don't have wood? So what? You do nothing. Yoshevu batal. Torah amar tashbisus ami batechem. The Torah says you have to get rid of, destroy the chametz in your home in any matter that you can. So also we'll stop over here for today in the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda trying to prove the idea that ultimately, again, bir chametz can only be accomplished through sreifa, and ultimately, again, telling us, although the kavachomer from Nosar failed, and Meretz Hashem, we'll see where Rabbi Yehuda takes this from tomorrow. We'll say, wishing everyone a good and Erev Shabbos, a freilich and Zos Chanukah, a beautiful Shabbos Kodesh, and incredible zechus to learn with all of you. Thank you for accommodating me. Wishing everyone a wonderful day. Yeshakayach, everyone.